6 years.
On the night of February 15, 1933, a single gunshot in Miami changes the course of world history. President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had just delivered the Democrats a crushing victory and promised to secure the rescue of the United States from the depths of the Great Depression, is struck down before he can take office. His ambitious plans to reshape the nation die with him. A stunned country watches as President Herbert Hoover presides over a solemn state funeral. On March 4, 1933, Vice President John Nance Garner is sworn in as President of the United States. Garner does manage to pull the nation out of the Depression, but at a far slower pace than Roosevelt had envisioned. His conservative instincts clash with the sweeping reforms Roosevelt had planned. Emergency banking measures, limited public works, and the repeal of prohibition stabilized the economy, but the recovery is sluggish. America limps forward while the rest of the world accelerates towards chaos. The United States enters the late 30s weaker, poorer, and more isolated than ever, just as the world begins to burn. Across the Atlantic, Europe descends into darkness. In 1933, Adolf Hitler seizes power in Germany and dismantles democracy with terrifying speed. Political opponents vanish, Jews, communists, liberals, and anyone who stands in his way is crushed under the weight of the new Nazi state. To the south, Benito Mussolini tightens his grip on Italy, building a fascist empire and dreaming of resurrecting Roman glory. Together, Hitler and Mussolini begin carving up Europe, while Britain and France cling desperately to appeasement. Germany absorbs Austria, dismantles Czechoslovakia, and annexes Memel. Italy devours Ethiopia and Albania. The two dictators formalize their partnership with the Pact of Steel, binding their futures together. War is no longer a distant possibility, it is inevitable. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan launches a full-scale invasion of China. The Imperial Japanese army sweeps across the countryside, capturing major cities and committing unspeakable atrocities along the way. The war becomes a brutal, grinding nightmare for the Chinese people. But Japan faces a United States that's weaker and more isolationist than ever, and President Garner has no appetite for foreign entanglements. Congress is even more reluctant, and America is more inward-looking, economically wounded and politically divided. Japan sees a free hand, with no embargo, no lend-lease, and no American pressure to stop their conflict in China. With the US asleep, Japan's army pushes for a more northern strategy to defeat the Soviet Union and secure Siberia's resources and eliminate the communist threat once and for all. And then comes a moment that changes everything. In the summer of 1939, Japanese and Soviet forces clash along the Mongolian border. The fighting is fierce, chaotic, and decisive. However, Stalin was paranoid of sending his generals out to the Far East out of fear that they may plot against him, and refuses to send Gorky Zhukov to Mongolia, keeping him in Moscow and sending a lower-ranked general instead. This, combined with the Red Army still being weakened by Stalin's purges and lacking competent leadership, leads to the Battle of Nomonhan becoming a Japanese victory and not a defeat. This single moment reshapes Asia. The army gains enormous prestige, and the navy loses influence, and Japan adopts a two-step plan. First, to subdue the Chinese and secure its resources, and second, strike north and destroy the Soviet Union, with China isolated and the United States uninterested. And now, Japan's path to expansion is wide open. After securing a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, Hitler invades Poland on September 1, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war, plunging Europe back into conflict. And the early stages of war unfold with a terrifying speed. After Poland's collapse, Denmark and Norway fall in April of 1940. On May 10th, Chamberlain resigns and Winston Churchill takes his place. On that same day, Germany invades the Low Countries in France and encircles nearly 400,000 Allied troops at Dunkirk. However, Hitler does not order his panzers to halt despite their overstretched supply lines and the infantry lagging behind. Instead of 338,000 men escaping, only about half manage to make it out as Germany squeezes the pockets shut. The rest of the men are killed or captured. Paris falls soon after, and France collapses, and a collaboration government is established in Vichy under Philippe Pétain. By August of 1940, Hitler controls most of continental Europe. Italy joins the war and begins fighting the British in Africa. Hitler, believing the Luftwaffe can soften up Britain for an invasion, launches an aerial campaign. But after a limited British bombing raids hit Berlin, Hitler shifts his strategy, ordering the bombing of British cities. This gives the RAF time to rebuild, leading to the failure of the German air campaign and forcing Hitler to reconsider his next move. By late 1940, Hitler analyzes the strategic situation. Britain stands defiant but isolated. The United States remains neutral under President Garner, who wins re-election in 1936 and continues his cautious isolationist approach. His policies stabilize the economy but leave America far from the industrial giant it would later become. His reluctance to confront Japan or support China leaves Asia wide open for Japanese expansion. The 1940 U.S. election becomes a contest between two isolationists, Democrat Burton K. Wheeler and Republican Robert Taft. Both oppose intervention, but Taft is more willing to act if America is attacked. Wheeler is a staunch isolationist whose economic policies mirror Garner's. Ultimately, the weakness of the economy and the uncertainty abroad leads to Taft's victory. With Britain still resisting and the United States unwilling to intervene, Hitler shifts his focus. Instead of launching an invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, he decides to secure the Mediterranean first. Mussolini's failures in Africa and Greece force Hitler's hand. Rommel is sent to North Africa, and Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all join the Axis. After a pro-British coup in Yugoslavia, Germany invades the nation and Greece in April of 1941. Allied operations in the Mediterranean are severely hampered by the overwhelming Luftwaffe presence. As Rommel pushes towards El Alamein, Hitler orders the beginning of Operation Felix on June 20, 1941, the invasion of Spain. Bilbao, Zaragoza, and Barcelona fall within a week, and on July 1st, Franco surrenders and joins the Axis, allowing Germany to reach Gibraltar. British defenses are strong, but after a fierce week-and-a-half-long battle, Gibraltar falls on July 15th. Gibraltar gone, the Mediterranean is effectively sealed. British supply lines must travel around Africa to reach Egypt. Malta is bombed relentlessly and captured by August 15th, and El Alamein falls in September. German forces enter Cairo on October 18th, and the Suez Canal falls on November 19th. The Royal Navy evacuates Cyprus and flees through the Suez Canal before destroying it right behind them. By early 1942, Germany has secured the Mediterranean, stabilized North Africa, and pushed into the Levant. The Reich now controls a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Middle East. By the summer of 1941, Japan secured the entire Chinese coastline and was pushing deeper inland towards Chongqing. The war in China was brutal and slow, but without foreign support reaching Chiang Kai-shek, China's fate was effectively sealed. The United States, under President Taft, remained firmly isolationist. Garner's early reluctance to confront Japan had already signaled to Tokyo that America would not intervene, and Taft's victory only reinforced that belief. Japan's army's leadership understood that window to strike north was opening. In October of 1941, Hajime Sugima became prime minister and chose specifically to prepare the nation for the coming war with the Soviet Union. The Japanese high command believed that the Red Army, weakened by purges and stretched thin across its vast territory, could be defeated if struck simultaneously with a major German offensive. In November, Joachim von Ribbentrop traveled to Tokyo to finalize a secret agreement, the Togo-Ribbentrop Pact, which was signed quietly, committing both nations to a coordinated assault on the Soviet Union in 1942. And unlike earlier diplomatic maneuvers, this pact was not about avoiding conflict with Moscow, but it was about destroying the city. By early 1942, the Axis powers were aligned more closely than ever before. Germany controlled the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Balkans. Italy held the Central Sea and its colonies. Japan dominated East Asia and was preparing for a massive northern offensive. The Soviet Union stood alone, surrounded on two fronts, with no hope of American aid and only limited British support. The Red Army had spent 1941 rebuilding and reorganizing, but the loss at Nomonhan had exposed a deep weakness. Stalin's purges had gutted the officer corps, and with Japan threatening Siberia, the Soviets were forced to keep nearly 1 million men in the Far East, troops that would be desperately needed in the West if the Reich were to strike. And the stage was set for the largest coordinated military operation in human history. At dawn on May 22, 1942, the German Reich launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Just hours later, the Imperial Japanese Navy began bombarding Soviet coastal positions in the Far East. The war Stalin had feared for years had finally arrived. Germany deployed nearly 4 million soldiers supported by 3,000 aircraft, divided into three massive army groups. The plan was ambitious but focused. Unlike the originally planned 1941 invasion, which had attempted to seize everything at once, Operation Barbarossa planned to concentrate its strength where it mattered most, the South. Army Group North, under Richard von Leve, fielded 750,000 men. Their main objective was to secure the Baltics, capture Riga and Tallinn, and apply pressure towards Leningrad, but with strict orders not to overextend. The goal was to contain the Red Army, but not reckless advance. Army Group Center, led by Gerd von Rundstedt, commanded 1.2 million soldiers. Their mission was to keep the Red Army pinned down in the central sector, pushing towards Smolensk and Bryansk, with Moscow as a tertiary objective. Their role was to draw Soviet reserves away from the true Schwerpunkt. Army Group South, under Theodor von Bock, was the heart of the offensive, with 1.5 million men. It was the largest and most heavily mechanized force Germany had ever assembled. Its mission was clear: sweep through Ukraine, encircle Soviet forces, and seize Stalingrad, push into the Caucasus, and capture the vital oil fields of Baku, Grozny, and Myakop. With the Mediterranean secured, Germany would be able to commit its full strength to the Eastern campaign. Simultaneously, Japan launched Operation Kantoku-go, striking across the Amur River and into the Soviet Far East. The Japanese advance was swift. Vladivostok came under siege within days, and Soviet forces were forced into a desperate fighting retreat towards Khabarovsk and the Trans-Siberian Railway. And the Soviet Union now faced a two-front war with no allies capable of providing meaningful support. The German advance was devastating. The Red Army, despite having an extra year to prepare, was overwhelmed by the scale, speed, and coordination of the Axis assault. By June 1st, German forces had advanced to the gates of Riga. In the center, the Wehrmacht launched a massive offensive towards Minsk, drawing Soviet reserves into a series of grinding battles that stretched from Minsk to Smolensk. The Soviets believed that the main German thrust was aimed at Moscow, and they committed their best units to the Central Front. This is exactly what the Reich wanted. In the south, Army Group North executed a series of massive encirclements. By late June, German forces reached the outskirts of Kiev. Soviet commanders, believing they could hold the city, launched a major counteroffensive. Instead, they walked right into a trap. The Germans encircled and destroyed nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers in and around Kiev, one of the largest encirclements in military history. With the southern front shattered, the Germans pressed their advantage. Kharkiv fell on July 4th, and by mid-July, the Wehrmacht had consolidated its gains across Ukraine and prepared for the next phase of the offensive. On July 8th, German forces entered Crimea and quickly encircled the Red Army in Sevastopol. The city fell after a brutal siege, opening the gateway to the Caucasus. On July 20th, the Germans launched a massive southern thrust, sweeping through Rostov and Krasnodar before descending on Stalingrad by mid-August. The Soviets had anticipated the importance of Stalingrad and had spent months fortifying the city and surrounding the region. The Volga River became a lifeline, ferrying in limited supplies and reinforcements under constant German bombardment. The fighting in Stalingrad quickly devolved into the most intense urban combat in history. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Japan advanced rapidly through Siberia. With Germany seen as a primary threat, the Soviet defenses in the east were rather thin. Japanese forces pushed all the way to Lake Baikal, but with worsening weather and overstretched supply lines and the sheer size of Siberia, this forced the Japanese to halt by late September. Their front stretched from Irkutsk to the outskirts of Khabarovsk, a massive line that required an enormous amount of manpower to hold. As August turned into September, the battle for Stalingrad intensified. Street-to-street fighting consumed the city. Entire blocks changed hands multiple times in a single day, and the Soviets fought with desperate determination, knowing that the fall of Stalingrad would be the open road into the Caucasus. On September 29th, the Germans launched Operation Gefangenkoin, a massive encirclement maneuver that cut off supply from the city from the north and south. The Volga remained open, but only barely. Supplies trickled in under constant fire, and the Red Army attempted several counterattacks but lacked the strength to break the encirclement. The battle dragged on through the brutal winter of 1942-43, and temperatures in the city plunged. Ammunition ran low, and entire Soviet divisions froze or starved in the ruins of the city. But by February 1943, the German Sixth Army had finally crushed the last pockets of resistance, and Stalingrad had fallen. By early 1943, the United States had maintained a precarious neutrality for nearly a decade. President Taft had expanded the Navy's neutrality zone across the Atlantic, escorting American merchant ships and shadowing British vessels, but he remained committed to keeping the nation out of the European conflict unless directly provoked. German U-boat activity had intensified dramatically after the fall of the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic had become a hunting ground where American and German vessels often crossed paths in tense silent encounters. On January 3, 1943, the SS Manhattan departed New York City, escorted by 3 U.S. Navy destroyers. The ship carried hundreds of American civilians, doctors, sailors, and a handful of diplomats bound for Reykjavik, which the U.S. Army had occupied to prevent any German threat to Greenland or North America, a heavy controversial move inside the neutral United States. However, 4 days into the voyage, a wolf pack of 5 German U-boats detected the convoy. Believing the Manhattan and its escorts to be British vessels carrying war materials, the submarines attacked. The torpedoes struck with devastating effect. The Manhattan sank within minutes. 2 of the 3 destroyers were lost, and hundreds of Americans died in the freezing Atlantic waters. News of the attack reached Washington within hours, and the nation erupted in outrage. People called it the Second Lusitania, and as the American public that was content with the war quickly changed their position. On January 8th, an emergency session of Congress was convened, and after intense debate, the United States declared war on Germany on January 9, 1943. Germany's European allies declared war on the United States in the following days. Japan, however, did not. Its navy was positioned entirely for the Northern War against the USSR and the defense of its newly expanded empire. Tokyo had no interest in provoking a naval conflict with the United States while they were still fighting in Siberia and suppressing resistance in China. America had finally entered the war, but only against Germany. The United States began preparing for a long struggle. Its industrial base, still recovering from years of economic stagnation, shifted into wartime production. Troops were trained and deployed cautiously, and the first American forces arrived in Egypt, reinforcing British positions and preparing for future operations in the Middle East. But now, the U.S. military was far from the juggernaut that it would become in later decades. For now, the U.S. was a secondary player in the conflict, dominated by Germany, Japan, and the USSR. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the German victory at Stalingrad and the capture of Astrakhan opened the gateway to the Caspian Sea. The Wehrmacht pushed relentlessly towards the Caucasus, and the Soviets, desperate to slow the German advance, initiated even more intense scorched earth policies than before. Oil wells were set ablaze, refineries were destroyed, and pipelines were ripped apart. Entire towns were evacuated and burned to deny the Germans any usable infrastructure. But the German advance continued southward. By June of 1943, Case Blue was in full motion as German forces crossed the Terek River and pushed into the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The Soviets fought fiercely, using the rugged terrain to their advantage, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. By August, German troops had broken through the mountain passes and reached the outskirts of Baku. The city's fate was sealed, and by October 1943, the entire Caucasus region was under control of the German Reich. The Soviet Union had lost its most viable oil fields, its industrial heartland had been devastated, and millions of its soldiers were dead or captured. Yet, the Red Army refused to collapse. It dug in on new defensive lines stretching from the Volga all the way up to Leningrad, and it determined to hold what remained of the nation. By late 1943, the war had entered a new phase. Germany dominated the European continent, Japan controlled much of East Asia and Siberia, and Italy ruled the Mediterranean. But the Allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the remnants of the Soviet Union had regained enough strength to launch new offensives. In Europe, the Germans prepared for a long war of attrition. With the Caucasus secured, they now possessed the oil reserves needed to sustain their war machine indefinitely. But the Soviet Union, though battered, was far from defeated. Its factories in the Urals continued to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery at astonishing rates. Its population, hardened by years of suffering, remained determined to resist. The stage was set for a new round of counteroffensives. In March of 1944, the Allies launched a major offensive in the Middle East. American, British, and Commonwealth forces landed in Kuwait and began pushing northward. Iraq, which had been under Axis influence since the fall of the Mediterranean, was liberated in just 2 weeks. The Levant fell by April, and the Allies then turned their attention to the Suez Canal, the vital artery that had once connected the British Empire. The battle for the Suez was fierce. Italian forces, supported by German advisors, held the canal with determination. The Allies launched repeated assaults, but the Axis defenders repelled them again and again, and it was not until July of 1944 that the Italians finally withdrew to El Alamein, establishing a new defensive line that halted the Allied advance. The Middle Eastern campaign had succeeded in reopening a path towards Egypt, but the cost was high, and the front remained unstable. Back on the Eastern Front, Germany launched its final major offensive of the war in July of 1944. Operation Typhoon aimed to break the Soviet lines around Smolensk and Bryansk and create a massive balled-up collapse to the Red Army's central front. At first, the offensive succeeded. German forces pushed towards Kaluga, creating a deep salient, but the Soviets, now far more experienced and better equipped, counterattacked the German flanks. They struck a position, encircling nearly 400,000 German soldiers. The Wehrmacht fought desperately to break out of the pocket, and after a week of brutal combat, they managed to successfully break out. But the half of the pocket was destroyed, and thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles were lost. Operation Typhoon marked the end of Germany's offensive capability, and from this point forward, the Reich would try to fight defensively to hold its gains in Europe. Between October of 1944 and January of 1945, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive, liberating Smolensk, Bryansk, and Tallinn. But however, the winter halted their advance, and both sides prepared for the next phase of the war. In August of 1944, Chongqing finally fell and the nationalist government surrendered, but China did not. The countryside erupted into insurgency. Communist guerrillas launched ambushes, sabotaged railways, and attacked Japanese garrisons. Japan had found itself trapped in a vast, unwinnable counterinsurgency that drained its manpower and resources. In Siberia, the front remained largely unchanged from 1942, and Japan had achieved its territorial goals, and the Soviets considered the region a secondary priority compared to the German threat. However, the Red Army did manage to retake Irkutsk by late 1944 and stabilize the front line. By spring of 1945, the war reached its final and most desperate phase. The Soviet Union launched a major offensive aimed at retaking Stalingrad, the city whose loss had nearly broken the nation. The fighting was brutal. Soviet troops advanced street by street, house by house, determined to reclaim the city that bore their leader's name. But the Germans held firm. Their defenses were deep, fortified, and manned by veterans who survived years of brutal combat, and after weeks of savage fighting, the offensive was stalled, and the Red Army had failed to retake Stalingrad. On June 8, 1945, Joseph Stalin was assassinated by his own generals. Years of paranoia, purges, and catastrophic losses had finally turned his own military against him, and the military junta seized control of the Soviet Union, determined to end the war before the nation collapsed entirely. By the summer of 1945, every major power on Earth was exhausted. Germany held a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea, but its armies were overstretched and bleeding. Japan controlled East Asia and Siberia, yet found itself bogged down in endless counterinsurgency campaigns and a massive occupation zone that consumed manpower faster than Tokyo could replace it. Italy clung to its Mediterranean empire, but its economy was strained into the breaking point. The Soviet Union, battered by our own recognition, had lost its oil, its richest lands, and millions of its people. Britain was bankrupt by years of war, and its empire was cracking under the weight of debt and overextension. And the United States was, though finally awakening from isolation, was still years away of reaching its full wartime potential. No side could win, no side could afford to continue, and no side could collapse without dragging the world into an even greater catastrophe. The assassination of Stalin on June 8, 1945 by his own generals was the breaking point. The Soviet military junta that replaced him understood the truth. The USSR could not fight another winter. The Red Army was exhausted, its supply line stretched, its industrial base was crippled, and the generals who seized power were not idealists, they were realists, and they knew the war had to end. At the same time, powerful factions within the United States and United Kingdom were pushing for the negotiations. The British public was weary after years of fighting alone against the Reich. The Americans, having only recently entered the war, were unwilling to commit millions of men to a long, grinding continental campaign. Japan, too, faced growing unrest at home, and the military stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The world was ready for peace, not because anyone wanted it, but because no one could continue. In July of 1945, representatives from every major power gathered in Istanbul, a neutral city positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. The negotiations were tense, emotional, and often bitter. Each nation arrived with its own demands, its own grievances, and its own vision for the post-war world, but all understood that compromise was the only path forward. The talks dragged on for months. Delegates argued over borders, spheres of influence, reparations, and the fate of occupied territories. But slowly, painfully, a framework began to emerge, a settlement that would freeze the world into a precarious balance. In Asia, Eastern China, devastated by years of war, was left fractured and unstable. Japan retained control over the western regions, securing the resources it had fought so hard to obtain. The Soviet Far East, stretching from Lake Baikal, was ceded to Japan, formalizing the gains of the Siberian campaign. Mongolia was declared a neutral buffer state, separating the Japanese sphere from the weakened Soviet Union. In Africa, Italy lost control of its East African colonies, which were placed under temporary Allied administration. Egypt was divided at El Alamein, with the western portion remaining under Axis influence and the eastern portion under Allied control. Tunisia was ceded to Italy, while the rest of French Africa remained under the authority of Charles de Gaulle, who retained control over France's overseas empire outside of North Africa and the Gold Coast. In Europe, Germany's pre-war borders were recognized, but its wartime gains were largely preserved. Poland, Denmark, and the Benelux countries remained under German control. Norway was liberated but required to remain neutral. France regained partial sovereignty, with the Vichy government returning to Paris, but Alsace-Lorraine and Calais were annexed directly into the Reich. Champagne, Picardy, and Franche-Comté remained under indefinite German occupation. Yugoslavia remained fragmented, its ethnic divisions deepened by years of conflict. Greece became an Italian satellite, with Bulgarian territorial claims reorganized. Gibraltar was transferred to Spain, now firmly aligned with the Reich, and Malta was incorporated into it, and the Eastern Front was practically frozen in place. No reparations were to be paid by any power. All equipment purchased during the war would be paid in full. And most importantly, a new international organization would be created, not to preserve peace, but to preserve balance. This organization would be called the Global Equilibrium Council. On August 30th, 1945, a final conference was held. President Taft, Marshal Zhukov, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Clement Attlee, Xiango Togo, Benito Mussolini, Philippe Pétain, and Francisco Franco all signed a preliminary version of the treaty. Hostilities would officially end on September 2nd at 12 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and the finalized treaty would be ratified in February of 1946. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. war had killed tens of millions, reshaped continents, and shattered empires. But unlike the great conflicts of the past, it did not end with a sense of triumph or closure. Instead, it left the world suspended in a tense, uneasy equilibrium. Germany and Japan, once close partners, began drifting apart almost immediately. Their wartime cooperation had been born of necessity, not trust, with the Soviet Union weakened and still alive, and the United States was now emerging as a global power, and both nations were beginning to prepare for the next inevitable confrontation. Japan, now in control of vast territories across Asia, entered a naval arms race with the United States. The Imperial Japanese Navy, emboldened by its victories in Siberia and China, sought to secure dominance in the Pacific. The United States, recognizing Japan as its primary rival, began expanding its fleet at an unprecedented pace. Britain, bankrupt and exhausted, faced the slow collapse of its empire. India, the Middle East, and Africa all began pushing for independence. The British government, burdened by debt and dependent on American loans, struggled to maintain control. The Soviet Union, humiliated and devastated, prepared for revenge. The military junta that replaced Stalin focused on rebuilding the Red Army and restoring the nation's industrial base. Though weakened, the USSR remained a formidable power, and one determined to reclaim its lost territories. The United States and Germany had entered a race to harness the power of the atom. Both nations understood that nuclear weapons could define the next era of warfare if obtained. Laboratories in Berlin and New Mexico worked day and night, each side determined to be the first to unlock the secrets of atomic energy. Militaries across the world refused to demobilize. The war had ended, but the peace was fragile. The world was one crisis, one miscalculation, and one diplomatic failure away from another global catastrophe. Many believed that the question was not if another war would break out, but when. But to prevent any single power from dominating the world, the victors established the Global Equilibrium Council, a new international body designed not to preserve peace, but to preserve balance. Unlike the earlier attempts at global governance, the GEC did not pretend to be moral authority. It did not promote democracy, human rights, or disarmament. Its sole purpose was to maintain the status quo and prevent any nation from becoming too powerful. The council was dominated by the great powers, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Small nations were allowed to speak but had no real influence. The GEC held mandatory congresses during crises and recognized spirit of influence and authorized collective military action when the balance of power was threatened. It was called a pragmatic system, but in a world still reeling from the most destructive war in history, it was the only system that could hold the fragile peace together. What comes next? Will the GEC hold the balance? Will the superpowers clash again? Will the suppressed peoples rise? Will the British Empire collapse violently? Will Germany and Japan turn on each other? Will the United States reshape the world in its image? Will the Soviet Union seek revenge? And will Hitler ever find his other ball? Only history can answer, and in this world, history is just beginning. Sudrian out.